Well, I've got one quotation from a very interesting book by an economist. She's Elizabeth Durbin, and she writes, "The focus on particular problems, the choice between different economic means, and even the use of one economic model rather than another may also be affected by the values of the economic advisor and by the policy process itself." So she's really saying, and I agree with this, that they're not value-free. The idea of a value-free science is simply invalid. There's always, and when you talk about models or theory not being value-free, you are, what set of values are you referring to that contaminate them, so to speak? Well, ideology is probably the generic name for a non-free, non-value-free exercise. You say it's ideological. You want to contrast it with something that is scientific almost, or that we can all accept, because ideology is a view from somewhere, whereas what we aim for in science is a view from nowhere. And we don't get that, I think, ever in economics.
There is a book by a famous Italian economist who was called Paolo Silos Labini. He wrote this book about that was a study on social classes. Social classes. And it's a really good essay, but the preface or the introduction, I don't remember, it's really impressive because it's basically a short treatise on, I would say, epistemology. So he's listing different disciplines. So he's saying the biologist looks at, the animal world, and he looks at the animal world from the outside, so it's not involved in the process of analysis and so on. Therefore, this is I'm going to reveal you my point of view, my own ideology. I'm a university professor, I'm a progressive, from a political point of view, I have a progressive point of view. I'm a social reformist, therefore my theoretical analysis is conditioned by my point of view. Right. So that while you read my essay, you should take this into account. So in a way, I'm being honest by telling you this.
Okay.
I mean, one might not agree with this standpoint, but I find it interesting too.
In other words, put your biases and prejudices up front. Write your textbook and say, look, I'm a member of the Communist Party or I'm a member of the Fascist Party, and my textbook will reflect my particular bias. And you have to read everything I say, all my equations and everything else, take them with a huge pinch of salt, because they symbolize things that only I regard as important, or something like that. I mean, yes or no?
Well, I don't think he went to that extreme point of relativism. No. It's just a way of saying that although you might and you must be rigorous in your economic analysis, but the thing that you say about selecting stylized facts, that's where, or selecting assumptions, that's where your vision of the world comes into play.
Yeah. And of course, even it can come in your econometric testing. What are the relevant things? I could give you my bias straight away. It's not a particularly political bias, but it's a bias that comes from my first degree being in history, and so my bias is to see economic doctrines as contextual and not as universal, and my historical knowledge leads me to see that different periods produce different types of economics. I'm then always fascinated by the way in which certain ideas persist over all the epochs, or certain, both ideas and less techniques, but certain ideas, have persistence. They don't change. They're things that change. They're bits of economics that are historically variable, and there seem to be bits of economics that are historically invariable. And I'm really interested in the relationship between those two. But that's my particular bias, and that makes me more interested than usual, perhaps, in the methodology and the history of ideas. So, do you have any biases? Do you come to the subject with the biases you recognize?
I come from a much more social background. I, started off doing international relations in my undergraduate degree, focusing on political science and a little bit of sociology. And so I've kind of always been an enemy, if you will, of econometrics and mathematical modeling, because I feel like it's, as you pointed out over the course of this lecture, really eliminated a lot of elements that I think have a major role in the way economies function. But I think what this all gets at is the lack of real teaching about methodology and epistemology and ontology and the fundamentals of the way we think and kind of the theory of knowledge. And, I don't think there's one right, correct methodology or epistemology, but I do think that it's important to be familiar with all of them and understand when they're being deployed, because that can change so much of what you're engaging with. And I don't think that's something that's really taught to economists, and I think that's a failing. In my degree, I'm doing a research degree, and we have 2 separate courses on methodology alone. And it's been very illuminating because we talk about economics and we also talk about the various other fields that relate to international development. And having that strong grounding now, I bring it back to economics when I'm trying to bring other elements into my economic analyses. And I think that makes it stronger, and it also makes it easier for people to understand, a bit about my biases, and then to be able to evaluate from there how they feel. And I think that's impartiality in economics, I don't think is ever feasible. That's, I guess, one of my other biases. So
yeah, but can you the historian is often told, look, you're never going to get a value-free account of the origins of the First World War, let's say. But there is the correct and incorrect use of evidence. They will try and set up a model rather like, in a way, an ideal court of law, in which you examine all the evidence and you come to a verdict of some kind. And it's never going to be unchallengeable, but it's what you ought to try to do. And therefore, it is bad technique to ignore evidence that most people might think you should consider irrelevant to the topic. It's bad technique to falsify evidence. And so there is something, isn't there, in the idea of striving for something being value-free, even though you know it's not going to be.
I think maybe one of the key aims of economists who make these models should be to be transparent about what those values are. For example, you can have a socialist model of the economy, a more neoclassical model of the economy, and because they don't get down to the underlying values that are determining what kind of model they choose, then the discussion and disagreements between them are quite superficial and shallow. And I think they'd be much more informative if, as well as perhaps aiming to reduce their values in their choice of models, they were also aiming to be completely transparent about the values that are determining the kind of assumptions they're making in their models.
But don't they try to be?
It doesn't even necessarily need to be, well, I am a critical realist, and that's why I'm looking at this macroeconomic issue in this way before every single paper. It could just be a pure discussion of these very philosophical issues in general, ongoing. And economics just I feel like it often tries to go out of its way to avoid it. And this, I suppose, also brings us back to, is economics a hard science or a social science? And, if you are having these discussions about the theory of knowledge and the way it's perceived in your discipline, I feel like a lot of people think that automatically precludes you from being a hard science and precludes you from getting the sort of respect they want, and therefore, whether correctly or not.
That's what Paul Samuelson said, of course, and I quoted him right at the beginning of the course. If you can, you do science. If you can't, you babble about methodology, and we're babbling about methodology, but we're babbling about methodology because we are no longer nearly as sure as we once were that we were doing science.
Would it be possible to do both economic theory and economic analysis without the device of models? I mean, would it be possible to do economic theory by just, put forward a coherent list of sentences and statements, and to do economic analysis by interpreting and describing data that come from whatever source? Of course, need to be assessed and need to be collected rigorously. But I mean, would that be possible to do that? Perhaps a more rigorous approach to the study of the economic world.
I feel that's sort of what was done through the classical economics point of view. However, that when you do it through a non-modelling perspective, then you are very open to interpretation.
Yeah.
So those people who hadn't modelled, so in this way that we do now in the mathematical realm, like Marx, Ricardo, the models that they built that weren't based on mathematics are still being interpreted to today. So therefore, the structure of the modelling as we use it now allows a very clear mechanism which can be debated in itself.
Yeah. If Marx had tried to model his theory, would anyone be interested in it today? You see, in a way, the fact that it was a narrative and therefore highly suggestive in all ways beyond, the sentences themselves, means that it survives. I wondered whether I thought that was where you were heading in your remark, but perhaps you weren't.
I was more going in the direction that providing the clarity of a model instead of a narrative moves further towards falsification. So if Marx laid down a basic model, no one would be interested now if it was wrong or more falsifiable than it.
But also on the selection of certain aspects and on the simplification of them. So you actually reduce the complexity by building a model, because you, of course, in order to transform it into a mathematical form, you have to leave something out, okay, and you have to simplify something to reduce it to a variable or a parameter, which is something that might be disputable.
I think there are bits of economics that aren't really modelled, and I read Paul Collier and people like that. I don't see models. I see narratives, actually, and some critique of government, which you could have done in the 18th century without any maths at all. So surely a lot of very, very valid economic analysis doesn't actually require the formalization of models. For what bits of economics is model building useful?
I think the example that you just gave of, a very specific end goal, like if you are putting together a theory and you want to illustrate very rudimentary how it would function in practice, I think that can be useful. It can be very clarifying. But, I hesitate, like you've mentioned a few times already, in terms of predictive abilities, I think models kind of lose something in translation and become less coherent and functional. But I think in terms of trying to do a direct illustration of something very limited, I think then they can be useful. But
Keynes really introduced modeling, and macro modeling started before micro modeling. And macro modeling was the modeling, because you had to calculate the difference between actual output and potential output, and you had to have a model. You had to have models which enable you to do that in order to know how much exogenous demand you had to put into the economy. So I think modeling the economy was really a byproduct of wanting to get certain policy implemented. Am I right in that, just as a...
So in that sense, modeling is as a form of persuasion?
Well, it's more, well, it was intended to be more than that. It was intended to be a basis for policy making.
Yeah. I was actually about to just point out, because I think it comes down to the question of what actually we want economics to do, and if economics is supposed to really just inform policy and really give insights on what policy and how policy should be conducted. And I think models seem to be the way to go. And for me, actually, the reason, one of the reasons why we today are so preoccupied with models in mainstream economics is that we came to, as economists, serve policy rather than anything else. And I know when you were talking, Peter, about Marx and the fact that, when we do qualitative analysis, we come to be, the analysis itself, by definition, will come to be open to interpretation, which on its own might be good, because we might get, if other people of different biases read it and interpret, maybe different kinds of insights. But then when it comes to policy and you have so many different insights, it's just very different to conduct any kind of policy with a qualitative analysis of the whole society or the economy, where different kind of insights are available, but it is not really clear what is for the policymaker to do and what is for him actually to what policy they should choose, which economics maybe to some extent is supposed to help resolve.
Yes, and I suppose there are other, firms model their potential markets. So as soon as you, so that I'm just trying to establish uses of models as opposed to really to answer your question, Simone.
Oh, on your provocation about, models being used for policy purposes, I have two historical objections, if you want. The first one could be, the famous book of Keynes, How to Pay for the War.
Yeah.
So, if you look at that, there are lots of tables, data, and so on, and there is a really coherent and clear proposal for, how to tax rich people, to spend the money in certain to deploy certain resources in certain areas, and so on. It's a very detailed and argued piece of work. And the same thing about the Keynes plan at the Bretton Woods conference. It's basically a piece of economic theory on how the international monetary system works. But in both cases, we don't have any economic mathematical model or any econometric model.
Well, there's an implicit model in How to Pay for the War, which people, of course, are very easy to, they could easily reduce it, which is that your model really is, it's an income output model, and you find that you, at full employment, you need to withdraw a certain amount of resources from ordinary civilian consumption and place them at the disposal of the government, and you need a taxation system that enables you to do that, and then there are variations on that. So, there would be no difficulty in creating a model out of it, and you don't then always have to read 120 pages of narrative in order to get there.